The modern healthcare system is not only a product of colonialism, but also of century-old belief system that's shaped how we see health, healing, and the human body. In this episode, I'm going to talk about colonial superiority bias, confirmation bias, and the historical rejection of holistic practices, which have underpinned many of the challenges here in today's healthcare system. I know for myself, I've encountered so much resistance from not only the conventional healthcare system, but also just from standard consumers being undereducated or worse, miseducated. So I really feel that the dismissal of centuries old healing practices is really more so a product of bias and division. The historical suppression of historical health practices and philosophical separation of mind and body have significantly influenced modern medicine. Here's a bit overview of some of these developments. So let's start with the late medieval and early modern periods where the Catholic Church played a really pivotal role in the persecution of individuals, particularly women, who practiced traditional healing methods involving herbs. The Hammer of Witches, a 15th century guide on witch hunting, authored by Dominican inquisitors Henrik Kramer and Jacob Springer, explicitly targeted midwives and herbalists. The text stated that no one does more harm to the Catholic Church than midwives, associating their use of herbs and natural remedies, of course, with witchcraft. This association led to widespread witch trials across Europe, where the use of herbs were often cited as evidence of witchcraft. For instance, in Poland, herbal practices were mentioned in a small portion of trials, but they rarely commanded the attention of the magistrates. However, in some cases, such as that of Dorado Paleka, the verdict explicitly declared that for practicing all sorts of witchcraft and enchantment with herbs, she has to be burnt alive at the stake. So there's that. Now let's look at Descartes, 17th century French philosopher, introducing the concept mind-body dualism and positioning that the mind and the body really functioning as two distinct entities. He argued that the mind is a non-extending, thinking substance, while the body is an extended, non-thinking substance. This separation suggested that the phenomena between the mind are non-physical and exist independently of the body. His philosophy laid the groundwork for viewing the mind and the body as separate, leading to the development of distinct medical disciplines. So, as we know today, our physical health is often addressed by a physician focused on bodily ailments alone. Your mental health is handled by a psychologist or a psychiatrist who concentrates on the mind. Environmental health can be managed by specialists examining external factors affecting health, but are often overlooked, misunderstood, or neglected in general. Emotional health is often addressed by counselors or therapists. Your spiritual health is typically overseen by religious or spiritual advisors, if one has a practice or a relationship at all. And ancestral health is not even spoken about and definitely overlooked in Western medicine, but more so a talking point. This compartmentalization has led to a fragmented healthcare system where individuals must consult multiple providers, often without integrative care. When we start to look deeper, we see that despite historical suppression, contemporary research has still validated several of the holistic practices. I also want to look at some of the fragmentation within our healthcare system. And we'll be able to address a little bit more as we go along. But I just really wanted to bring to light at least some of the information. The other thing that I want to bring up is that many times there are lots of practices that have deep historical roots. In fact, there's a lot of suppression and demonization of Indigenous healing practices that have significantly impacted the health and cultural identities of Indigenous communities worldwide. Take, let's say, St. John's wort, which has been effective in treating mild and moderate depression. have somebody from a non-conventional practice say that, and well, there we go. We'll be demonized. But have a conventional practice say that, and it's a modern miracle. Colonial practices and colonial powers have systemically undermined indigenous knowledge systems, particularly traditional healing practices, to assert control and promote Western medical paradigms. In Canada, for example, amendments to the Federal Indian Act in 1885 criminalized Indigenous ceremonies such as the sundance, which were integral to traditional healing and cultural expressions. These prohibitions lasted until 1951, aimed to erode Indigenous cultural identities and suppress their healing practices. Similarly to New Zealand, the Toang Suppression Act of 1907 targeted the Maori healers and criminalized their practices to replace them with Western medicine. This legislation disrupted the transmission of traditional medical knowledge and practices among the Maori people. Colonial authorities often portray Indigenous healing practices as primitive, superstitious, unscientific, non-evidence-based, just to name a few. And though these taglines are set to really justify their suppression, anti-vax, for instance, is another tagline that's often used really to demonize and shame people that are looking for a proper informed consent over their treatments. This demonization facilitated the imposition of Western medical systems and has marginalized Indigenous knowledge. For instance, during the European colonization of America, we've talked about this, where many times Indigenous healers were labeled as witches or sorcerers, leading to their persecution and then, of course, decline. The suppression of traditional healing practices has had lasting effects on Indigenous health. The erosion of these practices have disrupted holistic approaches to health and healing that integrate physical, environmental, mental, emotional, spiritual, and ancestral practices. This fragmentation has contributed to health disparities and a loss of cultural identity among Afro-Indigenous people all around the world. And just so you know, when I say Indigenous, I'm also referring to Black Indigenous people. I really strongly believe that we are the true Indigenous people, not to erase any other people groups, but just understand that our roots run truly deep and are old. Our genetics withstand the test of time and have deep historical roots. So our genetics and our bloodlines have seen these atrocities, and unfortunately, we haven't been able to get out of them. I know heavily in my research, and one of my degrees, I think my PhD, is, we cannot heal in environments to which made us sick. And when we look at studies of, let's say, Indigenous Native Americans, we see that even sequestered on their reservations, not being able to fully practice their healing practices have definitely impacted mental, emotional, spiritual. So understanding that even if we had, let's say, 40 acres and a mule, we still would need to work the land and have a space for us to be able to heal. My desire is that people that decide to create their own lands really reserve a space. Sometimes in different cultures, they call it different things. I know a lot of times working with more of South American cultures, the healing space is called a maloka, where in the Native American cultures, it's the medicine wheel. For Afro-Indigenous heritage and practices, they can be all sorts of things. And we'll get into those a little bit later as I pull from different research. So let's look now, let's shift our gaze a little bit. Now that we have looked at really how modern medicine is like taken over and it's all, mired in what's good and what's bad and what's right and what's wrong. And it's really demonized our practices significantly. And even people that could benefit, some people just really turn the blind eye because they've been brainwashed to believe that none of it is helpful. So let's talk about dismissal and disconnection. When I was early on in my practice, I was really excited to be a part of a team, to collaborate with other providers, to be able to, you know, really be an advocate for patient health and healing while also holding space for their conventional doctors and working integratively. After all, I'm trained in integrative medicine. I'd call these doctors full of enthusiasm to discuss a patient's case, only to many times being shut down, dismissed, hung up on. It was a trip. I think that in the beginning, they really didn't know what to think and just really were scared. My intention to reach out to them was to let them know that I respected their work and I was going to support them. And also, too, that I had the patient's best interest in mind and was also advocating for the patient's health and making sure that I was going to fill in any gaps in their education that they didn't know. So again, many did not receive me well. And I understand a lot of times people have a lot of fear and a lot of, like I said, confirmation bias where they already automatically assume that I'm some quack or anti-vax person or I'm going to tell the patient something crazy. It took me many years to earn the respect of the medical community, but I can say that towards the end of my practice and my physical practice, I had earned the respect of many people in the community, and they were referring patients. So it was a lot of hard work, but in the beginning, there was a lot of fear, resistance, and definitely disconnect. One of the cases that really sticks out to me that kind of is sad, but happens every single day. I remember when a young boy, a family actually came in, they only had one child, and they initially had difficulty with their child at school and just trying to get them sorted. And the father was in the military and went on deployment. So there was also a reason behind that. Mom was stay at home, really attentive and just wanting the best for her son. They lived in, well-established community, had a fairly decent school and school system, and I would say your typical average American family. However, they out of fear from the school system, were told that they needed to, quote unquote, medicate their child because their child's behavior was, quote unquote, not appropriate. So not appropriate meant they were moving around and maybe bored, tired, up, you know, normal children behavior, especially in a very structured and disciplined setting that may not be as exciting for them or may not appeal to their learning style. So many times schools pressure their students to seek conventional practices, and some even overreaching and telling the students about medications and different things to, in essence, anesthetize their child. In this instance, that's what happened. The patient was taking a sedative at night to sleep. I don't remember what it was, but it was a pretty heavy one, something in the world of like Ativan or something of that regard. It was pretty heavy, heavy duty. Definitely something that I typically don't see children on, typically more so an adult drug and heavy adult drug known, at that point. And then to combat the heaviness and grogginess, the child was being put on a stimulant during the morning, like think Adderall or Ritalin or something like that. So the child's circadian rhythm was all over the place, not to mention that this child had a lot of internal kinetic energy, and that was not being expressed through activity and things like that. Wasn't that it couldn't be installed, and eventually we did put it in there. But really, like this family system was really dealing with the father going away, also the child being really connected to his father, not being able to stabilize, having a lot of internal, emotional and as well as physical energy, not being able to express, mom doing the best she can, trying to manage all the things, and then the child being kind of led to a system that's only solution is to medicate. So I was able to really work on balance in the circadian rhythm. So oftentimes when I balance the circadian rhythm, I get the sleep pattern of the patient resolved first. And then that way I can I call it downregulate, upregulate. So I can downregulate a person at night so that they're able to sleep soundly. And then I upregulate them during the day so that they're more awake. And then you have that kind of afternoon crash, which I can deal with as well. But when I'm kind of reshaping the circadian rhythm because of adrenal burnout and fatigue or chronic infections or lack of nutrients or mineral deficiencies, there's a lot going on, when I'm rebalancing it. So I was able to really work on the nighttime routine. We were able to have the sleep med, from what I recall, is more of like a PRN. So I needed the physician's support and approval for them to titrate down the stimulant during the day so that I could, balance that part. And mind you, I had also encouraged the family, and they had gotten the child into, a physical activity. So he was doing really well with that. And then also too, we had him on a schedule, and we were really working with mom and dad on communicating about, how he feels about these deployments. And, everybody was really on board. I was really pleased with how willing everyone is. I know sometimes dads get a kind of a bad rap, and, dads can be very resistant to change and changing plans. But in this case, I really commend this dad because he knew that there was definitely challenges, and he was working hard to fill in the gaps. Mom was working incredibly hard to support little one, and we were seeing the results and the progress. And we just needed this conventional doctor to do their part, because legally, I can't tell a patient to come off of a medication or take a medication because it's a controlled substance, but I can work with an integrative physician, or just a physician in general who is open-minded and willing to listen. Not to mention the fact that I come with data. So the patient, let's say they're tracking their sleep schedule, or, we have some sort of external data to, and I'm going over the lab findings. Naturally, the way we interpret labs and the way they interpret labs are very, very different. And I would say that I don't think that the way they interpret labs is effective. I understand their perspective, where they wait to either manage a disease or to diagnose something based off of the symptoms the patient's presenting with. But there's a long runway before a patient develops a diagnosis. And so there's huge gaps where a patient can be prevented from having to receive that medication, have that physician have either the proper training, or that patient is also going to a provider like me who's trained in functional medicine or laboratory diagnostics or integrative medicine, and really understands how to read the labs and how to make sure that there's prioritization and therapeutic order when it comes to supporting the body's ability to heal. So when I called this psychiatrist, they were very rigid and very defensive, and really was very accusatory and, firm in they are only going to follow the FDA protocols. So they were not willing to think outside of the box, listen to what we had done so far, and really be supportive around, encouraging a lesser, pharmacological intervention. It was kind of like, this is what the standard protocol is. I don't see this person. I don't see this family. I don't see their progress, and I don't see you. And so that dismissal and disconnection, I can only really comes from that superiority bias, where conventional doctors often perceive our approaches as unscientific or even inferior. And then confirmation bias reinforces their stance. So they only trust evidence that aligns with their training while ignoring any real world outcomes or patient trends. I can often see this too in patients as well. If you even go to, let's say, my Google page, and I know I reference these things a lot, but you see where people put scam artist, and, they're really not recognizing the nuance that comes with our practice. there is a huge emotional component to what I do, which can be deeply triggering and deeply emotional. And I'm not saying that every single review is unmerited. There's always three sides to every story, yours, mine, and the truth. But my thought process is more so to bring up that I typically don't see unconventional doctors where they write scams, regardless of the thousands of dollars that they paid. I even have somebody upset and calling me a scam artist for charging $200 for a consultation, never even looking at a person's explanation of benefits, which is their post receipt or bill or itemization of what's being charged for their ineffective conventional practice. $200 is a steal, if you ask me, for the amount of health data and health information that you get. But I digress. There is this mindset that if it's not coming out of the mouth of an MD, not only does it not exist, but it's not valid. And regardless of what data you provide, because I can take thousands of pieces of data, put it all together in an organized way and tell a story and create a report and a treatment plan that's easily executable for the patient and very easy for an integratively minded provider to follow along and for me to even incorporate what they are doing into the treatment plan so that the patient can be effective, adherent, and compliant to a well-rounded treatment plan. I would say that psychiatry is one of those professions I've had the least success with when it comes to integrative healthcare. I'd say oncologists were probably some of the more open because at certain points, they were just reaching and looking for as many answers as they could, and they were really more open and willing. I'd say neurologists were also pretty willing, I would say. Cardiologists, incredibly willing, very open, and some even trying to adapt more holistic practices because there's not a lot of surgical interventions. There are a lot, but they're very limited in terms of the method of treatment, in terms of pharmaceuticals and surgical interventions in the world of the cardiovascular system. So they tend to rely heavily on lifestyle changes, dun, 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 So it's important to, understand perspective. Naturally, orthopedics, I've worked well with as well, working with patients pre and post op. Plastic surgery, excellent work with pre and post op as well. Endocrinologists work seamlessly with, rheumatologists work seamlessly with. So, for the most part, a nephrologist, no issues there. I mean, I could go down the list. There's so many specialists, but I would say that the top hot buttons were the psychiatrists who definitely cussed me out the most, but I would say that counterbalanced it. The oncologist, although I would say a lot of different personalities, but we'll get into all of that later. I would also say that there is a legacy of dismissal, that the historical demonization of herbal medicine, and then also the split to the present day dismissal of just having an integrated healthcare system, bringing in the mind, the body, the spirit, the emotional, the environment, the ancestral. All of that burden is now placed on the patient to understand these things and coordinate. Oftentimes, I would get patients that had been to every doctor underneath the sun. They had been to every specialist, their primary. They may have started off with their primary, and then they were carted around as specialist after specialist. Nobody really getting it fully, everybody getting maybe a little piece and a lot of medication along the way, and that patient not finding any relief and ending up in my office with absolutely more, disinformation, misinformation, apathy, frustration, financial stress, all kinds of things. Like it really put a lot of burden on me in practice to, be that miracle for the person or be different than every other provider, or even holistic provider that they'd been to, because a lot of times they'd come in and they'd been ripped off or whatever, and coming into my practice like afraid that I'm going to do the same, and then having to like browbeat me or get me to perform to kind of reaffirm or re-soothe. But I digress. Like, there's this brokenness in the healthcare system has so many impacts that I've seen. And we'll get more into the iatrogenics as well, which is more of that emotional toll and the just the lack of trust now that so many providers, patients, because they've been passed around to all of these providers, they really don't have a great sense of connectedness or understanding of how their body is working. And that's why I really lean into my public health education background, because I think that's really the answer. Your doctor doesn't need to necessarily tell you every single thing to do, but you do need a baseline of education and understanding of how to check your body, what to tell, what's right, what's wrong, what works, what doesn't work. And that's why I really love health technology and remote patient monitoring and teaching patients their health data. Because once you teach a patient, let's say that their salivary pH levels need to be, as close to 7 as they can, now you give a patient a tool, the pH strips, and a metric, where they can work towards. So maybe they test their pH in the morning and it starts off at 5. And so they know that their body is incredibly acidic, and they know that their body is now more susceptible to inflammation, or more just susceptible to oxidative stress, or just having a more difficult time to be able to digest, especially things like protein. So now that person is really going to load up with greens, maybe some smoothies, fresh vegetables, beets, things like that, and lift that number up so that they are really taking care of their body and keeping that inflammation low. These are simple things that can be taught at home that I teach in another podcast that I have, Health Tech Goddess, where we really talk about more of the practical to-dos, and we use our app with that. I really see, a vision for healthcare to really be more integrated, decolonized. If a patient is working with multiple providers, they're working collaboratively. Again, I've had difficult experiences, but I've had even more positive ones. I've had patients, like, I'll give you one example where a patient went to a rheumatologist. They had tried conventional practice, they weren't at the point of being given a steroid, but they were definitely on an immunosuppressant and a mild pain med. And they were very concerned about the long-term effects of this. The rheumatologist respected their decision, but it really put the burden on the patient to find me. So the patient found me. I went through the data. I went through the information. I can't remember how long it took. It was probably about 6 months. And again, we had to work on, mental stuff, emotional stuff, spiritual stuff, all sorts of things along the way. New job, new opportunities, fears around that, real life stuff while she's changing her diet and taking supplements and having to, balance the cost of all of that. But I will tell you, after a period of working with her, her pain, was gone. Her numbers improved. Her rheumatologist was not only impressed, but felt really safe that this patient was proactive with their health and found a provider that was willing to help them. Because of the actual results that doctor saw, I began to see referrals coming from that physician, and still to this day. Because the thing is that when you do good work, it shows. You can prove it. That's the beauty of science. This isn't a smoke and mirror game. This is a prove or disprove game, which means you have to be really comfortable with being wrong. You can't have this superiority, everything, you've got it all figured out. And confirmation bias, unfortunately, is killing people. Because if a person, I always love that analogy, like if I'm a hammer, all I'm going to see is nails. And that's true. If I'm a conventional doctor and all I'm trained in is disease, I'm not going to see when the patient is at health risk. So in my practice, when I look at labs, I'm looking for 4 things. I'm looking for nutrient deficiencies in the body from diet and digestion and assimilation, which leads to that breakdown those nutrient deficiencies lead to a difficulty in elimination, detoxification. So nutrient deficiencies lead to an overaccumulation of toxicity, which then that overabundance of toxicity of heavy metals, chemicals, mold, all the things in our environment that we're being exposed to on a daily basis, that now begins to build into the system and affects organ function. This organ function now becomes suppressed. And then over time, as your organ functions become weakened, the terrains become weakened, and then eventually disease process happens. And the trick is finding causes well before they become a manifested disease to which that have to be diagnosed. There's a term in conventional medicine called active surveillance. And even though this isn't really active surveillance, I'm going to use this terminology. Active surveillance is pretty much where you're watching and waiting for a problem to either happen or not happen, right? There can be a lot. It's almost like in conventional practice, they look at all of it like active surveillance. So instead of saying, oh, your blood sugar, Mrs. Jones, has been a 90 for the last 3 lab draws, 90 is too high. What are you eating? They keep it at that and let it creep up to 96 and then 100 and then 120. And now all of a sudden, Mrs. Jones or whoever our fake patient was, I lost count, is, she's now ready for metformin or Victoza. And not to call these drugs out, but those are common blood glucose and diabetes medications. Now, this could have been prevented had this patient been educated about proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, and just simply monitored her diet and was given proper education. But these often practices are missed because conventional doctors are not trained in nutrition. And even if they are, the depths of digestion assimilation, because even if you're eating 100% healthy diet, you're not going to either digest or assimilate it. Or also there's bioavailability issues, which means absorption. So consider that there's very much this trickle-down effect where the historical or medical anthropologists have conceptualized these roles that the Catholic Church has made in demonizing herbs. We also look at, their perspective on Descartes' influence and the long-term effects of these ideologies on modern healthcare system. Even though, these are not necessarily my studies of history and medical anthropology, it always brings this up because I tried to understand from a logical perspective why patients were getting such disconnected, dismissed care. And even when I was bringing a very qualified, scientific, evidence-based, I hate that word, but let's just use it in this context, I was bringing data, right? I wasn't just saying, Mrs. Jones, I feel Mrs. Jones has a possible problem. I didn't say that. I said, Mrs. Jones is exhibiting A, B, and C, and so therefore I'm proposing, recommendation B, C, and D. I'm asking what you think about it. Let's talk about it. Thoughts, and I could go deeper on that, but, how did we get from let's work together as a team to, I don't even know who you're talking about and why are you calling me? And also to, this burden that is placed on the patient to understand, no, while, not being well, while holding up this provider and that provider and juggling around. And it's just a great stress that I just don't think is necessary. And so that's also why I really believe in decolonizing your healthcare so that you are educated and so you know what your responsibility is. I think most people, if they, let's say people are well informed and they are, taught at a very early age that their health is their responsibility. They're going to lean into that. And we're taught that, but there's a lot of lip service to that. And quite frankly, there's also just a lot of misinformation and a lot of fads and a lot of things that really just don't fit our specific profile and what it needs to be. So again, part of my goal, intention, and impact of all of my podcast series is really bring a voice to things that have been voiceless. And so I really encourage patients to begin to ask their providers holistic questions, even if they seem unconventional or outside the norm. And also to ask them what their background or training is, if they have any, or if they know anybody who has specific background or training on the impact of nutrition, bioavailability, the impact of, let's say, the mental, emotional, spiritual connections, impacts of environment, and just, let them know that you're really on a journey of understanding a holistic lifestyle and you're looking to incorporate more providers in, or wondering if that provider is moving in that direction. Now, I'm not a person that believes that conventional provider can be a holistic provider, but before you start grabbing the pitchforks and the knives, we will talk about that in another episode. I really hope that the future of our healthcare system is not with this silo, everybody siloed and nobody talking and nobody collaborating. In fact, before Rockefeller got a hold of our healthcare system, that's what used to happen. We all, as providers, respected each other's perspective and really worked in collaboration with each other. You go back to the original roots of, let's say, in the early 1900s, you see MDs and DOs and DCs and all different providers, indies working together really for the betterment of the patient. And the future is in personalized healthcare and a journey that I've been on for a long time with patients, understanding which labs to run, when, the therapeutic order of that. And there is a system to all of it. I really want more people to get out of this conditioning that unless very, very corrupted peer reviewers sign off on it, or, every single, pharmaceutical financed study is the holy grail of healthcare. These are some of the common issues that we have in healthcare and why we just simply cannot rely on our healthcare system alone. There is so much corruption and underpinnings, and it's really just a big distraction and admin and bloated cost and just so much red tape. And literally today, we have rising modifiable chronic illness. And what modifiable factors are things that a patient can change. So while the healthcare system is cannibalizing on itself, there are people that if they got pertinent information that could absolutely help them today, they could begin to change the trajectory of their health and not even require the broken healthcare system. So again, my goal here is really to help motivate, encourage, and inspire people to begin to trust themselves. Now, I know what you're thinking. Trust yourself? Oh my gosh. Then what will happen? What will happen to me? There is a balance there's a relationship that a provider has with their patient. So a doctor, again, in Latin means teacher. That's the role, is to teach. It is not to coerce or judge or subjugate. It is a more collaborative relationship. I really hope that we can get back to a collaborative relationship where we're working together as a team for each other, support and encouragement, but 100% for the patient's best interest. I am so grateful for the many conventional doctors that were willing, even though they didn't understand my practice fully, they were willing to work collaboratively with me. They trusted me. They trusted their patients. We all worked together and the patient got the result. Even after this many years, I'm still getting follow-up faxes from integrative providers I've worked with follow-ups with the same patients that we treated long after they even left my practice. See, that's the beauty about having a practice based in public health. It is an education practice where patients get what they need and eventually they grow out of me. It's like the bird leaving the nest, which I absolutely love. It just almost feels like a proud peacock, a proud mama moment when I have a patient, quote unquote, graduate from my practice and they leave. Now, I know what you're thinking. Leave your doctor. I've had patients for a long time. It's not that I go anywhere. It's that the patient wants to work solo for a while. They've learned a lot. They need to integrate everything that we've been taught. They can't fill up anymore. Like literally, listen to any of the work that I do. It's like a fire hose of information. And so it takes people time. Not everyone needs to learn things, at every single lightning speed pace. I think it's very healthy to digest things in a slow manner. I think it's good for the nervous system. I think it's good for the brain. I think it's just good in general, mind, body, and spirit. So I really encourage people to naturally begin to think about how you are handling your health, right? How are your healthcare appointments going? Are your providers listening to you? Do you feel encouraged? Do you feel supported? Do you feel like you're getting the acknowledgement that you need? Are you getting the resources that you need? Are you getting the answers that you need? And it's important to ask questions around your nutrition, around toxicity, around how the environment plays in, how your genetics plays in. There's a lot of education gaps within the conventional healthcare system. And when you begin to ask these questions, you're going to begin to see where this provider's education gaps are. Now, I know a lot of providers are working to bring in more conventional minded doctors or becoming that themselves. But again, it takes so much time and it's a real different mindset. I'll leave you with this. Conventional doctors' main role is to look for and diagnose and manage diseases. They are like the watchdogs of the body, right? Whereas doctors like me, with all of my different trainings and backgrounds and different types of doctors, I understand that a patient may not have a doctor like me, but they may have a psychologist, or they may have a functional medicine provider, or they may have an energy healer, or they may have a combination of providers and not have it in one person. A unicorn who is so hoping to not only create my little crew of unicorns, but also to teach a crew of unicorns. So we have all these hats and we can serve the patients, especially Black and Indigenous people, Afro-Indigenous people of this world. We learn how to heal ourselves dynamically and holistically. When all of those traumas happened, right? Historically, genocide, slavery, that made a mark on our mind, our body, our spirit. Some of us have soul wounds. Some of us have emotional body wounds. Some of us have mental wounds. Some of us have environmental wounds. Some of us have physical wounds. We are so fragmented as a people. So a healthcare system that encourages Eurocentric fragmentation and individualism and fear and coercion is not going to be a space for us to heal. Same way, a reservation for a native with no light and no healing and no ceremony is not a space and a land to heal. Whew. So I know that's controversial. However, we need to have our lands to heal, whether that is our own original lands that our people walked on, or that is created land, blessed land, commissioned land, purchased land, land that is our own. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's that. And maybe we cultivate that land because that land is called to us, and we work the land and we heal the land and we rebuild on the land. And we rebuild to also add centers and sanctuaries for healing, because those are needed mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. In terms of the separation, I hope that there's a coming together. I hope that a patient can see all kinds of different providers, whether it's physician, psychologist, nutritionist, spiritual counselor, and they all work collaboratively and interconnectedly, or you're seeing a holistic doctor who has lots of that training. I'm hoping that you really do additional reference and research looking at the witch trials, the Catholic Church, Descartes, all these things, and the early on days in practice, and really how we want to create some systemic changes, especially for better healthcare for our children. We need to really take a critical lens and a critical view at our healthcare system if we're ever going to decolonize it. Thank you for listening.